to decision-making about the built and natural environment, and it reflects the community's long-range and long-term future for land use in particular. So the plan is a legally required document in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Every county and locality must have one, and it provides recommendations. It's not law along the lines of, say, a zoning ordinance. So the recommendations in the comp plan are used by the Board of Supervisors, the Planning Commission, the Board of Zoning Appeals, county staff, and the community as the common basis for decision-making on land use applications. It's a living document, and changes to it are called amendments. All right, so as I mentioned on the previous slide, the comp plan can be changed through what are called plan amendments. There's various ways to amend the comp plan, but for today we're focusing on one, which is called the site-specific plan amendment process. So this SSPA process allows anyone to propose a change to the area plan volumes of the comprehensive plan, which are called nominations. Hold on one second. Apologize for that. I have a stray toddler on the loose. So the SSPA nomination period opens every 2 years on an alternating cycle between the North County districts, which are shown in this map in the blue, and the South County districts, which are shown in this map on the red. SSPA is the current incarnation of a process that we've had for decades, previously referred to as APR, for example. And right now, the current iteration of SSPA began in 2017 in the North County supervisor districts, the blue, and then oscillated in 2019 to the 5 South County supervisor districts in the red. So each north-south round of SSPA consists of 3 phases, as shown in this figure on the slide. So this first phase is called the nomination period. This is when anyone can submit a proposal or a nomination to change the comprehensive plan recommendations for a specific site. This is followed by a screening period during which district-appointed task forces and staff review the nominations in each district and provide a recommendation on which should advance for formal review as plan amendments. During the screening phase, the task force review is followed by a public hearing and recommendations on each nomination by the Planning Commission, and concludes with the Board of Supervisors taking action to advance some of the nominations for further study on what we call the Comprehensive Plan Amendment Work Program, which is essentially our list of plan amendments that we're working on with staff and the community. Following screening, we have an implementation period. This is when staff and the task forces reconvene and review the specific impacts and provide recommendations on the plan amendments resulting from the nominations. Once again, followed by public hearings with the Planning Commission, as well as a public hearing with the Board of Supervisors before they take action on the proposed amendment. If the plan amendment is adopted, then it becomes a component of the actual comprehensive plan at that point. So now that the full cycle of SSPA between North County and South County is nearing completion, staff has begun an evaluation of the existing process to determine what works and what doesn't in an effort that has been termed the retrospective, or the SSPA retrospective. So as I mentioned, this kicked off in October of last year, and it's identified a number of issues related to the cycle's length, community engagement, the submission requirements, as well as the overall resource allocation for SSPA review as compared to other planning priorities. So this evaluation identified 3 primary goals to improve the process, which are shown on this slide. The first is to reduce the overall timeline for the review. The second is to expand community engagement. And 3 is to ensure a better balance of site-specific plan amendment resources compared to other types of long-range planning studies, such as area-wide and county-wide policy amendments. This second goal also speaks to the need for improved information to be able to be submitted with the nominations to ensure that staff and those that are directly related or potentially even impacted or affected by the nominations to really clearly understand the proposal and the proposed land use change. So community outreach on the goals was conducted in October and November of 2021. This included a community survey, which we advertised all throughout the county, discussions with county agencies, interviews with our task force chairs and vice chairs, interviews with all the members of the board and the Planning Commission, as well as discussions with the development community. The results of this outreach, we'll go over a couple of specific things from the survey in particular. Were presented to the Planning Commission's Land Use Process Review Committee in January and the board's Land Use Policy Committee in February of this year, along with kind of a draft series of recommendations for potential changes to get the conversation going. Would also mention, we also reached out to a couple of different jurisdictions in Virginia and Maryland to see how they handle kind of similar processes for plan amendments for specific sites. One thing regarding the public input survey that we conducted, we used a tool for our public survey called Public Input. It's an online survey. We're very happy with the results. We got about 458 people that participated, leaving about 618 unique comments, as well as responses to each one of our specific questions. So advertising successfully received responses from all over the county. This map here shows kind of hotspots for participation in yellow, for example. Next couple of slides contain some of the highlights from the survey where we were asking about specific things related to the community's preferences for long-range planning. The full results of our survey can be found on our website. We put up some of the main results that have really kind of related to community participation here in the next couple of slides. So this first question asks, how do people stay engaged right now, and how do they hear about planning efforts? So we found that the district supervisors' newsletters, as well as direct contact with staff and the district offices, was kind of the preferred channel for communication. And this is in comparison to what we had kind of anticipated, which was that you'd have a heavier preference for social media, for example. But that was not kind of the most preferred for those that responded to the survey. Probably most importantly, actually, for the retrospective, we asked about people's preferences for engagement methods. How do people like to engage in land use planning efforts? And so we asked about community meetings, open houses, task force meetings, providing testimony at Planning Commission and in Board of Supervisor public hearings, as well as more passive methods. So the top method for engagement for both nominators as well as participants from the community were to conduct targeted community meetings for nearby residents. Kind of the current model, which is attending regular task force meetings. This was preferred by task force members, but as you can see, other types, nominators and the community, really kind of preferred this targeted community meeting model. And then finally, we asked about whether new potential criteria, such as a site plan concept, earlier nominator engagement, a letter of intent to file a rezoning with the nomination, whether these types of things would help result in a clearer, better developed nomination. There certainly was general agreement about the concept plan in particular, something that can visually describe the nomination along with a narrative. And then there was kind of mixed results, so to speak, regarding the other elements. So the results of these, as well as many other questions that we asked in the survey, and also the responses that we got in our interviews, these were all presented to the Planning Commission and the board earlier this year. The board and the Planning Commission formed a working group of 2 members of the Planning Commission, 2 members of the board, who met with staff in February and March of this year to consider a range of options for potential revisions to the process. And they did provide recommendations in March. So these recommendations are shown here, kind of summarized on this slide right here, and they address the overall timeline, they address community engagement, the nomination criteria, the justification criteria for a nomination once it's been submitted and we're starting to review it with the community, a number of changes to help kind of improve the process along the lines of the goals that we went over. So as I mentioned, this really kind of shows the results of that working group's deliberations. So in summary, the new process consists of a shorter 1-month nomination window that opens once every 2 years countywide. So that's a big change. Rather than having kind of that North County, South County oscillation every 2 years, we would do instead a countywide cycle every 2 years. So it speeds up the process. Submissions would need to meet new submission and eligibility criteria in order to be accepted for review, which we'll get to at a later point in this presentation. And then once accepted into the process, because they've been deemed eligible, they would proceed to screening. Community engagement during screening is a priority, and it remains so with the recommendations. However, we recognize that the demands that are placed on the task forces and the feedback that we received from this method really kind of had us take a look at the task force model during this phase. And we're not proposing to convene task forces during screening anymore as a result. Instead of using a task force, targeted community meetings would be held to ensure that those that are living and working near the subject sites are engaged early in the process. As I mentioned earlier in one of the previous slides, that community meeting model, that was the most preferred method of engagement for most stakeholders in the community, as well as the development industry as well. And they were thought to provide more appropriate forums for identifying, addressing localized issues than a task force. A planning commission workshop would take place in lieu of a planning commission hearing at the screening phase stage as well. This workshop model would allow for the public to participate and would also provide a more deliberative forum for screening with staff and appointed officials to ensure that the high-level nominations, the high priority nominations are advanced for further review. The Planning Commission would then make a recommendation to the board on which nominations would be added to the comp plan work program for further review as plan amendments. And then finally, of course, the board would take action on the work program, so no change there. So that's the second phase, the screening phase. And then the third phase, the evaluation phase, that would begin following the screening phase and the adoption of the work program. So the big thing here is looking at the individual amendments and making sure that we are focusing on the engagement model on the specific needs and circumstances of the amendments, and also looking at the availability of resources to review. So instead, the big change here is instead of assuming the use of a task force for every single nomination, which is our current practice of the evaluation phase, community engagement for each nomination would be designed based on the circumstances of the amendment to provide options for the most appropriate means for reviewing the proposed amendment. So, if you have a smaller singular amendment, limited scope, limited impact, most likely those types of smaller amendments could proceed through established means, such as an existing land use committee, obtaining feedback from surrounding neighbors via further targeted community meetings, making sure that we're ensuring participation from those that are most familiar with the site. Areas receiving multiple plan amendments in close proximity to one another, also those that have cumulative considerations, more complex studies, larger geography, greater impacts, those should and could continue to be considered through a task force model. So this engagement would be coordinated with the district board member and identified with the work program. So this adaptive engagement paired with more frequent nomination cycle, individual review schedule for each amendment during the evaluation phase, this can really help us reallocate community and county resources towards other planning priorities outside of the SSPA process, such as area-wide studies and county-wide amendments, which we think our long-range planning division, and we think globally, kind of is the preferred focus for kind of a long-range planning. So we really do think that with all of these changes, kind of as a batch, that we will be ensuring that we're focusing our efforts on the things that are kind of the highest of priorities. There are some additional changes we wanted to go over. We can go over them relatively quickly because I think I'm a little over my time here in terms of the presentation, but wanted to mention a couple of things that we are changing in terms of kind of the nitty-gritty details. So eligibility criteria, there are some changes in terms of what we would use to determine whether or not a nomination is eligible for the process. So, big changes in terms of the eligibility criteria. We're going to broaden the range of eligible geography by allowing the nomination of land areas that have been subject to a previous land use plan amendment after 2 years from the date of adoption. That's compared to a previous 4-year requirement. So by and large, more areas of the county will be eligible under the new process. We are clarifying that land areas are eligible if they are currently or were previously subject to board action on an amendment that did not result in a change to the site's land use recommendations, such as land use mix, density, intensity, for example. So one example that kind of comes to mind, the current Reston study, by and large, as we know it today, is not changing land use recommendations for specific sites in most instances. So this change would enable Reston, for example, most of Reston to be eligible for SSPA. And then we are going to retain the current restriction on submissions for countywide policy changes, systems changes. We are dealing with site-specific recommendations as a part of this process. And then we would also retain a current restriction on having more than one submission or more than one proposal or nomination by a nominator for the same property. Submission requirements. So in line with this idea of trying to be able to identify priorities as a part of the nomination period and screening period, we wanted to ensure that the submission requires really kind of help us enhance the community and staff understanding of the nominations. So these submission requirements would be used to determine whether a nomination should be added to the work program in advance of further review. So a couple of the things that we are going to be adding in terms of submission requirements, that illustrative plan that I referenced previously, something to visually depict the nomination. We'll also want to have information regarding the nominator's potential development timeline and kind of the key factors for engaging the community. We are going to require the consent of the property owner of the nominated properties, which is a change that currently there is no requirement, but we have heard loud and clear from nearly everybody in the community that that is an issue that needs to be addressed moving forward. We are considering a submission fee, something small, probably in the order of about $200 to $500 to help pay for certain outreach costs that are associated with the screening phase. And then again, we'll require a statement of justification, so no change there. This final set of blobs here, so to speak, or circles here, is regarding the justification criteria. So, as part of the nomination, nominators are asked to provide that statement of justification, that written narrative that describes their nomination, and it's based on a set of criteria. So during screening, these criteria are used to determine which should be advanced for further evaluation at the later stage. So a couple of things that we're hoping to do in terms of these justification is, try to use these more to really make sure that we are prioritizing plan amendments that are most in line with these justification criteria. So we're amending them ever so slightly. Most of these are kind of reorganization of the existing, but I'll go over them briefly. So we would ask that the justification narratives, really help us to address an emerging community concern or a change in circumstances, such as a change in the market conditions. How can you explain how the justification would advance planning objectives, broadly speaking, in the comp plan, or align with goals that are outside of the comp plan but are illustrated in other board adopted policies, such as the strategic plan, the community-wide housing strategic plan, the economic success plan for the county, the One Fairfax social and racial equity policy, for example. Hold on one second. Sorry, I got another toddler emergency. Hold on one second. So in conclusion, the recommendations for changes to the process were developed with substantive input from the community, planning stakeholders, and they provide an avenue for the county to better address long-range planning efforts. So we think of these as revisions to the existing process. The other room, please. Thank you, buddy. And so anyway, we are bringing the SSPA retrospective to the Planning Commission and to the board in the next couple of months, or in weeks, excuse me. So if you have any questions about the process or any of the elements to the retrospective, be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Real quick, Graham, this is Tim Dugan. You're going to have a presentation online.
Yep, we already have it, so I can drop a link. Sure. Douglas?
Yeah, thanks. That was really informative and interesting. Good changes. Just about the process, when you mentioned, for example, what would be an SSPA, what would be eligible, and you mentioned just continuing with your example, just hypothetically, I just want to clarify, just get a better understanding of how it works. So if in the rest and comp plan, there's a certain, I'm just trying to kind of envision, like there's a certain FAR in the TOD areas. Does that mean like a landowner and developer would apply for an SSPA if they wanted more FAR than what's in the comp plan? Is that kind of the scenario where that would kick in?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if you're wanting a different mix of uses, for example, if your plan, and it could be resting, could be anywhere in the county. If your plan, for example, says the plan recommendation is for an office use, maybe at a 0.5 FAR. And you want to do something that's a little bit different. Maybe the property owner is interested in mixed use. Maybe they want to convert it over to residential. Something along those lines. Could go any direction. Then you have this ability to request additional FAR, additional flexibility regarding the mix of uses. So could be mixed use, could be residential. It's up to the nominator to put in the request, and then we evaluate it for county policies. So yeah, that's exactly it.
Thank you.
Donna?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, you had said that community engagement, that the communities near where the subject development will be contacted. what are the regulations, or how close do you have to be to the development to be contacted?
Sure. So for comprehensive plan purposes, we have kind of established practices. We don't have existing kind of rules and regulations like you do for zoning applications, for example. But our practice is to, at a very minimum, contact 25 people that are immediately surrounding the property. In practice, we do far more than that. So we expand our radius much beyond 25 in most instances. And one thing that we've been getting better at is also picking up not just property owners but renters when there are renters that are kind of known in the area. So our outreach efforts, so to speak, would be to continue in that vein, make sure that we're engaging people that both live and own property near the site, but not just those that are property owners today.
Okay, and
one more thing. This is Megan Van Dam. I work with Graham in the planning office. I would add that we also contact HOAs. Typically, it's within a half-mile radius of the site. So if you're not an immediate abutting neighbor, or potentially we might also bring in, logically, sort of, if there are communities to round out the edges of those notification process, we might do that. But if you're not part of that group that gets an individual notification letter, you also may be captured by us contacting your HOA. So that radius extends out to about a half mile.
okay, I was going to say that's a good idea, and especially to contact the HOA presidents so that they can get the information out to the residents.
Yep. And I put a plug in, if I may. We use the county's the county contact list for those HOAs, and it's the responsibility of the HOA to keep their contact information current. So if anyone has any questions about how to do that on this phone call, we'd be happy to answer them, because sometimes we do get those letters back because HOA presidents turn over sometimes every year. So if you know anyone, or if you need that link, Donna, I'd be happy to provide it to make sure we have all those records up to date.
Yes, if you could provide it, that would be helpful. That's great. Thank you. Then the other thing is a clarification. So if I understood you correctly, there's no longer going to be a north and south process, that they can be going on continuously.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we had been hearing from a lot of folks in the development community in particular was that the frequency of the cycle and having kind of doing North County for 2 years and then South County for 2 years, for example, really didn't allow SSPA to keep pace with changes in the market. And so what ends up happening is that the board members, some of the board members feel a lot of pressure to do what are called board authorized plan amendments outside of SSPA. And so in terms of us being able to, both staff and the community being able to kind of regularly review those, there are plenty that kind of get authorized outside of the cycle today. And we think that frequency of the cycle is probably the main reason for it. And so the idea being that if you have kind of a more frequent cycle, that you'd be able to capture more of those types of amendments, in that regular review, as opposed to them going and being authorized, outside of the cycle.
Okay. And then one more question, if I can. I think you said that within 2 years, a nominator can resubmit a amendment that has been, I guess, rejected. But they have to list, why it should be, or they have to explain why it should be up for review at this time. What are the criteria for that, for reviewing it a second time?
So we would allow anybody to resubmit. So if they were screened out, for example, in a previous cycle, it need not be the most recent one, but in the past, they can submit again. What we would just be looking for is within their statement, we would just kind of put them on notice of being like, what has changed? What would compel a different outcome or a different look at this amendment if it's exactly the same. If they change it in response to the community's comments or staff comments, the planning commission board, terrific. I think we all want to take a look at changes that are in response to comments. But if it's the same thing and it's been submitted again, we would just ask them to justify that. You know, what is it that's compelling a different look?
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. I have a couple more resources that I can point folks to. One of them is we did publish a white paper containing the working group's recommendations on the process. So one thing I just dropped into the chat was a version of this presentation. And one thing that kind of provides a bit more detail in terms of the nitty gritty of the retrospective is our white paper, our report detailing the working group's recommendations. So I just dropped that into the chat as well. It's a good summary of the working group's deliberations and kind of the elements of SSPA both today and then also under the revisions. So if you have any questions on any of it, feel free to contact me, and happy to chat with you.
Owen, I have one more question. You said that the task force is, or they're not going to be a task force for every single nominated amendment. How is that determined whether a task force is needed or not? And if there's not a task force, how are the community residents notified that there's an amendment happening?
Sure, absolutely. So Donna, to your question, during that evaluation stage, one of the key kind of elements of trying to improve kind of the efficiency of the process, and one of the things that we would think in terms of using both staff, the community's time, and the task force's time to the best of our abilities, is to make sure that we have some adaptability during that evaluation phase to kind of right-size community engagement to fit the circumstances of the amendment. So kind of those very, very small, kind of singular, low impact or relatively low impact nominations that advance to the work program as plan amendments. In most instances, we think those can be handled through established means. So whether you have a land use committee in a district, going out and doing targeted community meetings, those would still be notified. There would absolutely still be kind of a notification process, open meetings, whether it's with the land use committee or with the community, with the immediately surrounding neighbors. But having kind of a task force model wasn't seemed to be necessary during that phase for every single plan amendment. Those that are larger scale, that are kind of more complex, have cumulative considerations in terms of having multiple nominations within an area. Those that have greater impacts potentially, those will still most likely require a task force. And so we're not abandoning the task force model by any stretch of the imagination. It's just making sure that the task forces are working on things that kind of compel the need for a task force, so to speak. Where everything right now goes to a task force, even if it's not truly necessary. So one of the things that we are really trying to hope to do is to ensure that we're kind of right-sizing community engagement, and the board members would be the ones that identify kind of what is the best means for community engagement once something is added to the work program.
Okay, thank you.
And the second part of your question was about notification. We will be sending out letters once something is authorized and placed on the work program to the same respective stakeholders adjacent and nearby, and that should it may not explain necessarily the complete package of notification. I'd imagine at the beginning of the process that may not be decided, but it certainly would provide resources and the web link to where information can be found about the study. And then closer to the hearing, so when public meetings are established, we would resend those letters.
Okay, thank you.
And it would be on the public meetings calendar. We'd work with the supervisor's office as well to put things in their bulletin. Graham mentioned that those bulletins and newsletters that the supervisors are sending out seem to be also very popular and great means of communication. So we'd be sending information through that method as well.
Yes, I can agree to that, because I know I'm in Supervisor Gross's district, and I find her newsletter to be one of the best pieces of information. So I think that is very good.
Yes, yeah, and I'm on a few of them as well, and boy, they're very thorough. There's a lot going on in the county, not just land use related. So it's great to get them and see what's to be able to keep up to date with what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Graham, there was a question in the chat as well from Tim Dugan. Do you expect that there will be a need for more staffing to address the entire county?
Great question, Tim. I think the answer is it really depends on the number of nominations that actually end up getting submitted. One of the structural changes that we're making with this countywide nomination period is those enhancements to the justification narratives, the submission requirements, the eligibility criteria. So we kind of think of all of these things as I guess you could say a package deal in terms of trying to improve the efficiency of the process. But the long and short of it is, if we have this countywide cycle, it kind of has to be paired with the changes to the criteria that we use to evaluate it. And it also has to be paired with the changes to the community engagement model to ensure that screening is taking place in the most efficient manner possible, and then also that the evaluation phase is more adaptable to the needs of the amendment. So if all of those things kind of hold, then we think that we'll be fine. We think that we'll have sufficient staff to be able to handle the increased frequency of the cycle. But we'll see. I think the idea is that the number of nominations that we get in will be manageable, but and everything that we've heard from the development community makes us think that we're kind of moving towards that we're not going to get a flood of these things, but we'll see what actually ends up coming in, and if we need to make changes to it after the case, then we absolutely will.
And I would add, I think one of the staffing issues that we experience with SSPA and with its predecessor APR is that because of the 4-year time length and the 2 cycles, there's sort of a wave of applications and nominations that are coming in. So if you only have one chance every 4 years to submit a nomination, then there's a sense of urgency. You have to get it in that window. And by having a more frequent countywide cycle, that urgency may be lessened, and that we overall, the amount of nominations that are submitted, it may smooth out a little bit, so we don't have those peaks with the North and the South County. So, but again, as Graham said, we will be monitoring it and talking with the Planning Commission and the board after the first, I would say, few cycles. So,
Commissioner Nijelski-Agnew, do you have a question?
And thank you for coming.
Yeah, appreciate your time. Speaking of the Planning Commission.
Good morning.
Morning.
Graham and Megan, one of the things I thought would be helpful, you've referenced a couple of times that one of the benefits of this approach is freeing up resources to focus on the longer term. And you've couched that in the context of changes to comprehensive plan or and so on. But could you elaborate a bit on what that really means in terms of studies that will inform those considerations, which is, I think, part of what you're hoping to accomplish?
Absolutely. I think there's kind of 2 angles to it. The first is looking at the changes to SSPA to ensure that we're really focusing on kind of the high priority nominations and advancing really only those that kind of really compel the need for a site-specific level of evaluation in comparison to other things, other elements of our work program that we think are also high priority. So we think of them as those with, frankly, near-term development timelines, those that are going to be ready to go with a development application, and then also those that have kind of that strategic importance to the county, even if the development timeline isn't quite so short-term, but those that we really just cannot ignore. So having higher priority nominations advance and really having only those that are higher priority advance should enable the total number that proceed to the work program to be limited. And then in so doing, that would free up time for those other types of amendments that are area-wide studies, county-wide amendments, to be able to focus on kind of the true long-term So that those in tandem will allow us, I think, to be able to work on those things that are kind of the highest priority, so to speak. I'm fighting a toddler here. Megan,
Yep.
do you want to elaborate a little bit?
Sure, sure. And I would just also add that I think having the criteria, having I don't want to call it, but more rigorous criteria to with the nominations may help formulate more thoughtful nominations that are more grounded and perhaps are more ready to go, um, if you will. So we are thinking about how we may have, because of that, and with the property owner consent, we may have fewer nominations that just overall allow us to talk with the planning commission and the board about other priority issues related to other area-wide studies. We've been talking about Centerville and Merrifield in your district, and we've been talking about looking at policy issues, countywide policy issues, for a very long time, to update policy sections within our countywide policy plan as well. I mean, many of those elements haven't been reviewed as a whole as well since they were adopted in the 90s. So we'd like to be able uh, to have time and the resources and staff and the capacity to do that, to update those areas, which in turn, by by looking at area-wide studies and looking at countywide policies and addressing, large sort of issues at that level, whether it's how do we look at making, with the changing retail market, how do we make shopping centers, more sustainable over the long term, and repositioning those at a countywide level. We would hope to also be able to address, the underlying issue of that we might see at a site-specific level, and so we might be able to take care of and prevent sort of nominations coming in at a site level because we've already looked at it at an area-wide or a county-wide level. And so that's
Yeah, that's helpful. Just real quickly, one of the key things, at least I'm interested in, is ensuring that the county has a stake in the comprehensive plan evolution, that it's a contributor to or participant in the process in a broad way. So what this SSPA process allows the community to do is for the development community to weigh in with ideas for changes to the comp plan and ultimately the zoning ordinance. But it should also allow for the county, or to put it differently, the additional resources, or the refocusing of resources into the kind of a longer term view, allows Megan to do what you just described, which is to say if the market is changing, or we have more abundant sites that where there's a county interest in seeing it revitalized, that the county has the ability to do the analysis and then focus its attention on those areas based on that analysis. So we haven't had that as much in the past number of years as we need to have as we look to a very dynamic future. Thanks.
Yep. And I would say for the SSPA process, under that that criteria for changes in circumstance would include market changes and market realities, and by having a more frequent cycle, we would be able to accommodate and address some of those shorter term or more immediate market shifts, so instead of the 4-year length. Graham, there's another question in the chat about the submission of SSPA nominations through Plus. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that's the actual submission process may happen come September?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that, Tim. We are working feverishly on that, right as we speak. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Plus, this is our new publicly accessible public database that we use for zoning applications, planning applications, all types of things that kind of run through the Department of Planning and Development. And so it's a very powerful database that can give us a lot of good organizational tools. But we are looking and are currently building, Tim, the module for being able to submit directly into PLUS. So nominations. Our hope is that if we start up the process for the nominations in September, that we will have PLUS ready to go to be able to submit, and for those that are nominators to be able to put their nominations directly into PLUS. So it's better than our current process, which is just something you print out and submit it to the Planning Commission office as a paper form. So we'll either have that, and if that's not quite ready to go for September, we'll have an online backup using a different tool. So I'm hoping to make things a bit more streamlined with an online tool, whether it's PLUS or this other form of GIS. But yes, we're pretty confident that we'll be able to do it via PLUS this time around.
And much like the rezoning submission module for rezoning applications, what's nice about the PLUS system is that once a nomination is submitted, the nomination address, its location in the county would be publicly accessible. So someone could search for what is in their district right as the nominations are coming in, which has not been necessarily the case. You've had to wait for staff to compile them and then publish it. So it removes that extra step, which is also, I'll put a plug in for that as well. And having that automated system allows for that.
Well, if you have any other questions, be happy to answer them. Otherwise, I really appreciate everybody's time this morning, and it's been a good discussion. And if you have any questions, let me put my contact information down into the chat. Feel free to contact me. I think I know most of you actually, but just in case, I'll be happy to answer any questions you have as a follow-up.
Well, thank you very much, Graham.
Yes,
Right.
thank you. Very good presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Y'all have a good one. All right. Take care.